Philip II is now the most powerful king in Europe. It's 343 BC. His military machine cannot be stopped. But Philip II has a son, and that son needs a teacher to become the next greatest king. Who should he hire? He wants to hire the smartest man on the earth, but when he's told what the tuition fee is going to be, it's not gold, it's not silver. To pay for the lessons, the king is going to have to rebuild the entire city that he had once burned to the ground. It was the smartest man in the world's hometown. Aristotle is basically asking for the equivalent of $450 million, and he'll tutor your son. Does this investment pay off? I'm Mr. Hull, and this is Ancient History. Welcome to Classical Kingdoms, where timeless stories reveal truth and wisdom for your journey. This is lesson number 38, the dawn of Alexander the Great's Hellenistic world. Today, we open into Alexander's education. What does he care about? Why does he have the Iliad in a box? Let's see exactly what the smartest man in the world is going to teach the greatest conqueror of the world. So Philip begins the headhunting of the perfect tutor. Talks to that Athenian leader Isocrates and the nephew of Plato, who's running the academy right now. Rejects them both because he chooses Aristotle. Aristotle of Stagira. That was a strategic choice because Aristotle's father, Nicomachus, had already been the doctor for Philip's father, the king, and they had a bond of guest friendship, Xenia. Have you heard of Xenia? Xenia, Ohio. But that's a special bond of hospitality, guest friendship. So that is some trust that's already built into the family, so to speak. But Aristotle is not a cheap hire. You know, when Philip offered him the job, Aristotle refused a salary. Instead, he demanded a fee that sounds like something out of a myth. He told King Philip, I'll teach your son, but you must rebuild my hometown. In 348 BC, during one of the wars Philip was fighting, he burned this city of Stagira. He sold the population into slavery, knocked down every wall. Now it's 5 years later, Aristotle held the king to ransom, demanded that Philip find every enslaved citizen of Stagira, buy their freedom. He demanded that the walls, the homes, the temples, everything gets rebuilt. So if we do the math on this tuition fee, 1,000 citizens, the cost of 2 or 3 mina each, that sounds like a lot of money. The cost of the construction, historians estimate over 500 talents. And could that be $450 million? That's just a basic idea of that. This is enough money to maintain a fleet of warships, triremes, for an entire year, and Philip paid it without blinking. Aristotle. Now that is the smartest man in the world. He sent agents across the Aegean Sea, and he found every slave, and the citizens of Stagira were so grateful. They started an annual festival called the Aristotelia. And this teaches us the first lesson about the Hellenistic world. In this new age, the power of the mind commanded the resources of the kings. This is the scroll, the wisdom, the brain power. If this is helping you understand the value of an education, the real way to think, why don't you share your comments in the chat, click the like button. You know, Philip proved that the software of the mind is worth the price of an entire army. If you already know what's going to happen with Philip II's son, the success of Alexander, then you know this is this is nothing. So where does this school, this education actually happen? Because Philip II does not want Alexander studying in the distractions of the noisy capital, Pella. He wants a sanctuary, a place of focus. So he assigned the temple of the nymphs at Mieza as the royal campus for this school, the tutoring of Aristotle. It's kind of a paradise with shady walks, limestone caves, and natural springs, and it's on the slopes of Mount Vermion. I've struggled to find good pictures of this, and I'll just have to go visit, take them myself. But Alexander actually doesn't go to this school alone. He's actually going to be joined by young noblemen. He's got a class. He's got a cohort. They're called royal pages. So I should introduce you to some of these famous classmates that would one day divide the world amongst them. Hephaestion. Hephaestion is son of a dignitary, and he would be Alexander's best buddy, soulmate. Like Achilles was so tight with Patroclus, that's like these guys, Hephaestion and Alexander. And then there's Ptolemy. Another son of a general. He would one day become the Pharaoh of Egypt. The Ptolemy family would start a dynasty that would take us all the way to this. Do you know her? Do you know that Cleopatra is a descendant of the Ptolemy family? Then we have Cassander, son of General Antipater, the intellectual rival who would eventually kill Alexander's wife and son. Several more classmates will be with Alexander through this entire journey to the Indian Sea, to struggles and saving Alexander's life in India. But this group lives together, trains together, studies together. They're like a wolf pack of future kings. So this should be interesting. Aristotle's job is to tame these wolves and turn them into leaders of tomorrow. And would it be Plato's version, philosopher king, or successors to Philip II? What are we doing here? Because this is a boarding school that is acting like a pressure cooker for extreme talent and these royal princes. You know that archaeologists have found some of the very stone seats where they sat in the setting. They found fragments of amphora, the clay pots that hold high quality olive oil that came up from Athens. They found bone stylus, right? You would use these bone stylus to draw into your wax tablets. So this is a school. You can imagine yourself sitting in this cave and listening to Aristotle and all of his famous wisdom. We'll get into some of that during this lesson. A lot of people put Aristotle at the top of the list, or maybe you put Plato at the top of the list, but this is a real school. This is quite the dream team, the molding of a dream team, and Aristotle's influence. What would you have done in a classroom where you knew all these general sons are going to be powerful and future kings? Would you compete? Would you be friends? Would you dream about big things? Hey, pay attention in class. Let's get out the lesson now. Let's learn what Alexander's mind is going to get filled with, along with these other guys. The previous generation was led by Plato. Plato would look up at the sky. Plato taught that truth is found in the forms. He would say, is this a triangle? And it's like, well, yeah, of course that's a triangle, but it's really not a triangle. It's only the form of a triangle. A triangle by definition, on a piece of paper like that, maybe if we measured it, it wouldn't be exactly a perfect triangle of, the way it was printed on the printer. It's really only a concept of a triangle. Plato taught that the truth is only found in the form, so that the triangle only really exists in this perfect form that you think about, that is really beyond our world. The forms are beyond our world. So Aristotle learned, they go in a set, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, but Aristotle looks down at the ground and he teaches Alexander the method of empiricism. Empiricism, have you heard of empiricism? If you've been in science class, you've definitely heard empirical. Aristotle teaches that knowledge begins with the senses, with observation, with the sight and the sound, maybe measurements, empirical data. He's turning these students into biologists, measurers, surveyors. Years later, Alexander would send steppers, they called them steppers, to go out there and measure the roads of Asia. Alexander later would send thousands of plants and animals back to Athens, where Aristotle would study them. So sources even say that Alexander donated 800 talents to help pay for Aristotle's further research on these topics. So that says a lot about the education, the interest, the goals. What's Aristotle's future going to be like because of this education he's getting in this dream team type of a school? Aristotle wants to create a scientist king. He taught Alexander to categorize the world in order to rule the world. But he also taught about excellence. Erate. What is erate? The Greek word erate, the virtue of excellence, or excellence as a virtue. Erate gives Alexander a Greek lens, the classical lens or the Greek scroll, as it were, the classical Greek scroll of excellence. Now, Aristotle gave Alexander a special book. You know this book. It's going to be one of his prized possessions, the copy of Homer's Iliad that was annotated by Aristotle himself. What are annotations? This would be fascinating to see this, but Aristotle is making notes, annotations on the copy of the Iliad. Alexander kept that scroll, the Iliad, in the casket copy, and he slept with that scroll. He also slept with a dagger under his pillow every night. He saw himself as the new Achilles, and he wasn't just fighting for land, he was fighting for kleos, eternal glory. Because if you know the story of Achilles, I don't know if Achilles really achieved kleos, but Alexander wants to do it. Eternal glory, the Greek kleos. But there's a dark side to this curriculum too. Aristotle wrote a book for Alexander called On Kingship. He taught that a king must be a benefactor. But he also taught a dangerous idea about the people of Asia. He taught that Greeks should be treated as friends, but barbarians should be treated like plants or animals. He believed that barbarians had no real ability to make decisions for themselves, and kind of built up Alexander with some intellectual permission to conquer, to rule, that they needed him as a ruler. He believed he was bringing order to the chaos. But as we will see, the student would eventually outgrow the master. Alexander would realize that the barbarians were not plants, but people. But for now, in Aristotle's school, the software, the scroll, is being written. So think about all the books, all the movies, the media that have influenced and shaped your view of the world, and then compare that to Alexander and these royal boys. There's a lot of influence in the science, the biology, and the scroll of the Iliad. So we've seen the classroom. Aristotle is giving them a gift. Now, does it work? In 343 BC, Alexander has an interesting test. A horse dealer brings this wild horse when he arrives at Philip's court, Philip II, the king. This massive black stallion with a white mark on his head like an ox. This is the horse named Bucephalus. The price for this horse was 13 talents. That's an astronomical price. If 1 talent is 6,000 drachma, 1 drachma is basically a day's wage. This is 78,000 days of wages, in our money, millions of dollars for a horse, but horses do go for millions of dollars, so maybe it's a fair price, but it's like a modern fighter jet. It's more than a horse. And this black stallion could be an incredible advantage. Philip's generals tried to mount the horse. Bucephalus went wild. He reared, he kicked, he threw everyone off. Philip was furious. He ordered the horse to be taken away. Useless. That's kind of the hardware approach. If you can't force it, just discard it. But Alexander has been getting this very special education, this classical education from Aristotle, influenced by Plato and Socrates. He's using wisdom. He shouted out. Alexander shouted, he says, "What a horse they are losing for want of skill and spirit to manage him." Philip mocked his son, but Alexander made a bet. If he failed, he would pay the 13 talents himself. Alexander ran to the horse, took hold of the bridle. He had been using his Aristotelian training of observation. The sense is the empirical observation, because he noticed that the horse was shying away from its own shadow. The shadow was dancing on the ground. It was freaking out the horse. So if the empirical evidence showed the shadow gave an effect of fear, the cause was the shadow, the effect was the fear, and Alexander turned Bucephalus to a different direction, away toward the sun, so that the shadow would fall behind him, and the horse calmed down immediately. Alexander stroked the horse. He whispered to Bucephalus and then vaulted onto his back, and he rode this $10 million, $15 million beast at a full gallop. And the entire courts of Philip saw what happened. They were in shock and silence and in awe. And when he returned, Philip wept with pride. He kissed his son. He says, "My boy, you must find a kingdom which is your equal. Macedonia is too small for you." Dramatic pivot of Alexander's youth, taming this wild stallion. It proved that the software of Aristotle's school is superior to the brute force of the old guard, the old way of thinking. Bucephalus became his partner for the next 20 years. Bucephalus, this is his famous horse. He would ride that horse all the way to India. When Bucephalus finally died, Alexander founded a city named Bucephala in the horse's honor. Wisdom, a lesson for you. What shadow is scaring you right now that you haven't empirically observed or tried to apply wisdom? Sometimes all you need to do is just pivot. Turn toward the sun. The light, the truth, makes it disappear. While Aristotle was training Alexander's mind, someone else was training Alexander's soul. It was his mother, Queen Olympias. Olympias was not from Macedonia. She was a Greek princess from Epirus. She was a devout member of a cult of Dionysus, and she worshipped in a way that she liked to dance in trances. Plutarch is a historian in the future. He talks about snakes that she would keep in her bed. She would sleep with snakes, tried to tame snakes. Anyway, it kind of terrified King Philip a little bit, and Macedonians didn't really get into this. Olympias whispered a secret into Alexander's ear that actually changes a lot and explains a lot. She told him that Philip was not his true father. She claimed that on the night before her wedding, a thunderbolt struck her. She told Alexander that he actually was the son of Zeus, king of the gods. What if your mother told you you were divinely created, conceived in a miraculous way? What does that do to your head? You know that Aristotle taught Alexander the golden mean. The golden mean. What is the golden mean? In fact, I could show you the golden mean, all these different virtues that he taught to these young royal princes. The idea that virtue is the balance between two extremes. So, like courage is the mean, the average balance, the middle between cowardice and rashness. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and wastefulness. And these are golden mean lessons, virtues. This is Aristotle's big thing. This is why a lot of people put Aristotle at the top of the list. His ethics that he wrote about. Now, Olympias taught something else. Pothos. Pothos. What is pothos? The Greek word that means a desperate longing for the impossible. A longing for the impossible. It is the desire to go beyond the map, to go beyond the realm that you know and reach divine status. Alexander was torn between the topic of a scientist and what his mom was telling him is, hey, you should have a God complex. You should want to go beyond what is possible and be a god. Alexander respected Philip's power, but it appears that he believes he was superior. He's being taught in a superior school. He's being taught by the smartest man in the world. He's being given gifts of wisdom and he's applying them. He's not just a successor to Philip. He was a demigod. Philip had a city named after himself. He built Philippi. He had already shown an extra 13th statue to the Olympian gods. This was the message. But Alexander is getting a message that kind of fuels a reckless courage. Why fear death if you're the son of Zeus, right? Years later in Jerusalem, the high priest Simeon would show him the book of Daniel. Alexander would read the prophecy of a Greek king destroying Persia and believed it was about him. He was always looking for divine validation. This tension between the rational map and the irrational dream is what's going to turn him into the Great, Alexander the Great. Would that eventually destroy him? Well, the Dream Team school doesn't last forever. The real world of politics crashed this party and closed the school in 337 BC. Got to head on to the bigger things. That's what you've been trained for. King Philip decided to get a new wife. The young Cleopatra, not the Cleopatra from Egypt and Julius Caesar. So this is hundreds of years before this. So he's got a bunch of wives. Cleopatra's the new one, and this is a threat. Why? Why is this a threat? Because Cleopatra is pure-blooded Macedonian. At the wedding feast, the wine flowed freely, too freely, in fact. Aristotle had warned against the vice of drunkenness, but the Macedonians ignored him. Attalus, the bride's uncle, stood up to make a toast. He prayed that this marriage would produce a legitimate heir to the kingdom. Wait, did you see this coming? It was a direct insult, calling Alexander illegitimate. You know, the golden mean of gentleness. Well, it's gone right now. Alexander threw his cup at Attalus and shouted, "Villain, do you take me as an illegitimate heir?" King Philip was now drunk. He was furious. He drew his sword to kill his own son. But his legs were too weak from old wounds, and he had consumed too much wine. Philip tripped and crashed face first on the floor. Alexander stood over his fallen father and delivered the line that cut deeper than any sword. Look at the man who is preparing to pass from Europe to Asia, but cannot pass from one couch to another. That's the end of childhood for Alexander. Alexander and Olympias fled into exile. Although they would return, the trust was broken. And 1 year later, in 336 BC, you know that Philip was assassinated in a theater. You know that Alexander will ascend to the throne by age 20. He was the king. He was the heir. He had the hardware of Philip, the software of Aristotle and the Greek classical legacy. And he had the fire of Olympias, his mom. In a God complex, the experiment has left the lab. The student has left the building. And Alexander would go on to conquer the Persian Empire. Maybe you know the story. You know that he's going to name 70 cities after himself. They'll be called Alexandria. But does the investment, the price to have Aristotle, did that education make those 70 cities any good? What Alexander does, will it be any good? You know, Alexander was taught about Megalopsychos, the great-souled man. Aristotle's dream of a man who claims the high honors because it is truly something he's worthy of. He struggled with the golden mean. He had excessive courage, leaping into enemy castles alone. He had excessive generosity, giving away fortunes to his friend. And he had excessive anger, eventually killing one of his friends in a drunken rage. In the end, he struggled and failed with the balance, but the legacy of Alexander, and we could see it in the type of city he would name after himself. And was he magnanimous as a leader? Timeless truth. We will find more about Alexander in coming lessons. But a true education does not just fill a bucket. It lights a fire. It's a spark. Alexander's education with Aristotle didn't just give him facts. It gave him wisdom and understanding, a way of seeing. It taught him that the world is a puzzle like taming a wild horse. It could be solved by the mind. And that's what you're doing right now in your journey with classical kingdoms. Thank you for being a part of this, because we hope that these lessons light that fire that will guide you through some of your own conquests. So thank you for taking the time to learn something that matters in all of history, and that includes your history, some classical truth for your journey. Because kingdoms rise and fall, power fades, but virtue endures.